Hi, everybody, and welcome to a special Point North one-shot on Ready Player One by Ernest Cline. I'm Alistair Stevens, and tonight we are going to delve into this genuinely fascinating novel, this genuinely odd novel, a novel unlike any, I think, that I have ever read, which is particularly strange given my own personal cultural context. The kind of novels that I read, particularly growing up, should have prepared me for Ready Player One, and yet somehow didn't entirely. Luckily, my life prepared me for Ready Player One, so I'm going to have a lot to talk about over the course of the next hour or so. It is great to have you all here with me, including Brian, I should say, who I believe, Brian, is this your first live session? It is good to have you here, sir. We have Becca and Angela and Aaron, and we're talking about Pac-Man Fever, and Mari is here. It's going to be a great discussion, you guys, as we move through this genuinely fascinating, genuinely curious, and completely unique novel. Ready Player One was published in 2011, the debut novel by Ernest Cline, who was born and raised in Ohio. The story is set in the dystopian future year of 2044, where the world has gone to hell and the populace has retreated from the physical world into a virtual reality known as the Oasis. The plot focuses on the search for an Easter egg contained within the Oasis that will hopefully save the world, or alternatively lead to a much worse fascistic kind of dystopia. I should say right now, right up front, that I am going to spoil this entire book. I'm going to discuss it in its entirety. So if you haven't yet read Ready Player One, I advise you to do so, particularly if you are between the ages of, I don't know, maybe 30 and 45. You should definitely read it, because if you were in any way connected to geek culture in the latter half of the 1980s, then this is the book for you. And it's fair, I think, to open this discussion by saying that if you are not in that particular age range, and if you were not connected to geek culture in the late 1980s, then this book may not be for you. I genuinely have no idea how broadly applicable Ready Player One is. Certainly, this is a beloved book in geek cultures. This has become, gosh, a signifier of value, a signifier of identity within geek culture over the last 6 years, which is entirely appropriate because we're going to be talking a lot about signifiers of identity and signifiers of geek culture as we move through tonight's discussion. But I genuinely have no idea how this book would work for someone who wasn't already connected to the video games and cartoons and pop culture of really 1984 through 1988, I suppose, is the most fertile terrain, but kind of 5 years plus and minus on either side. It is a fairly deft, fairly complex, and certainly assaultive novel. This is a novel that grabs you by the lapels and demands your attention. And if that is not your cup of tea, then I can see Ready Player One leaving you a little cold. But if you are the target audience for this book, then it will be, in a sense, your entire childhood encapsulated, or your teenage years encapsulated, because Ernest Cline manages to evoke a particular time and place without this being a period piece. This is, as I said, set in 2044. This is a sci-fi dystopian novel, which also manages to be a loving and affectionate and complex piece of cultural nostalgia in and of itself. Mari says 80s the best era in America, which I think is pretty fair. Aaron says, I think it is broadly applicable. There's a subversive commentary on the artificiality of how the kids embrace this pop culture that really holds for today's internet culture. That's the point, right? Is that while in some sense Ready Player One is a commentary on 2044 and a commentary on 1986, it is most stridently and most acutely and most perceptively a commentary on, well, 2011 may actually have missed the mark by a couple of years, but 2008, 2009, the end of the first real era of internet culture, I think that Ernest Cline manages to address some very real and trenchant concerns about digital life, about online life, about this remote exchange of social interaction that we're engaged in right now, particularly for those of you who are watching me live on YouTube as we stream, but even for those of you listening to the podcast version later. This is exactly the kind of distributed interaction that Cline is pointing to in the book, and making a couple of incompatible statements about. We're going to talk a little about how he treats the kind of punk rock triumph of the individual and the kind of social utopian, open source, Creative Commons, community aspect of digital culture later in the session. I find those two kind of opposed viewpoints to be completely fascinating. And there is a lot of opposition in this book. I'm going to talk a lot tonight about Cline's intentionality, not in terms of what he actually intended, but what the book leads us to believe he intended, what is actually being said as we move through this book. Access Stargazer in the YouTube chat says it was almost before VR headsets became mainstream. It absolutely was. He wrote this book before the rise of the Vive and the Oculus Rift and PlayStation VR, the current kind of VR standards that are out there. And of course, before VR itself was an absolutely workable technology. VR has been kicking around since, 1991, 1992. I'm old enough to remember the first kind of generation of VR where we were promised the future and given the past. I've seen VR mature now. And of course, the VR that is presented to us in the pages of Ready Player One is still science fiction. It is still the future, but perhaps not that far off, and perhaps it's not that distant. Cline really has his fingers on the pulse of gaming culture, of digital culture in 2011, and has managed to extrapolate very successfully, I think, in a number of ways, the kind of future movements of those industries. But it is so weird because the internet moves so swiftly, because digital culture in general moves so swiftly. It is so weird to look back at a book that was published 6 years ago and see it as a period piece. This is now an artifact of a time that has passed. There are numerous references contained within the pages of this book that I'm not sure would play terribly well to a 16-year-old picking up Ready Player One for the first time. It's not even necessarily the 1980s nostalgia that's going to throw that reader out. It's the 2011 nostalgia that's going to throw that reader out. It's absolutely fascinating. Echoes of Snow Crash, says Angela. Yes, yes. And Mari says, I feel so old, you guys. We're literally living in the future. That we are. Oh, and Mitch says, as someone born in 95, I found I was engaged by the book, though many references were things I knew of or about, but was not intimately familiar with. The enthusiasm around geekiness worked regardless. That's great. That's great to hear. And I do think that the Cline manages to walk a line, and it's a difficult line in the pages of this book, because this is not about nostalgia as a simple evocation. This is, as I said earlier, this is the baseball bat approach to nostalgia. This is nostalgic narrative saturation. He is besieging us with all the proper nouns of the 1980s, from video games to music to movies. He is giving us this sucker punch of nostalgic reference here, but he is also clearly mindful, as he's writing the book, of this kind of question of general applicability. So we will get explanations about things. It's really weird when we get to the first gate and we're talking about Joust, and it is, I grew up playing Joust, and it is impossible to me to imagine a time when I don't remember intimately my connection with Joust as a video game. And yet, within the pages, he takes the time to explain it, which kind of is a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, you have people who are acclimatized to this cultural milieu who are going to find the explanation either reductive or facile or just unnecessary, just padding in the context of the book. But then you're going to have people who, even if they were around at the time, perhaps never played Joust specifically, or never played Tempest specifically, or Pac-Man specifically. Well, okay. Is there anyone in the world who hasn't played Pac-Man? At least enough to understand the underlying concept. Perhaps you don't know about the Pac-Man kill screen. Perhaps you don't know about the fragmented cluster of ASCII art on the right-hand side of the screen when you reach level 256 of Pac-Man. Perhaps that's not a detail that you've ever encountered, but you're probably familiar with how Pac-Man works. But he gives us the explanation too. I should probably frame this entire discussion by saying that no single work of art is for everyone. This barrier to accessibility, this general applicability that we tend to value in works of art, in works of popular culture, that is virtuous. Books do serve to be, or books are served by a general readership. You want to communicate your story to as many people as possible without sacrificing the core intent and integrity of your work. But no one is going to love every single book that's out there, and no book out there is going to be loved by every single person. And the fact that there is criticism out there of Ready Player One, the fact that, particularly in the wake of the trailer for the upcoming Steven Spielberg adaptation of Ready Player One, the fact that there has been something of a critical backlash, something of a critical response, at least, to Ready Player One, does not invalidate the absolutely authentic emotional connection that many readers have had with this book. As I say, it is a little more complicated in the frame of Ready Player One than it is with many other novels, because Ernest Cline is so deliberately evoking and so assertively enforcing this nostalgia for a very specific time and place, a very specific fragment, a slice, a stratum of this particular time and place, because he's not talking about real pop culture in 1986. He's talking about underground culture. He's talking about this punk rock video game culture of 1986, and that's very different. So if you have a reference point to that, if you have a gateway to that world, then it's more likely to engage you, though even then it's not necessarily going to hook you. There are plenty of nerds out there who are critical of Ready Player One, sometimes for valid reasons, sometimes because this is the internet and there is always a backlash to things which are popular. Let me see here in the YouTube chat and catch up. Aaron says here, Wade is such a pedantic and arrogant nerd boy. This is a very fair observation. We're going to talk a little about Wade as we get in. I should say that the book, when it was published in 2011, but in 2010, the book was already notable because of the bidding war that erupted over it. And that's, even in 2010, that was unusual for a debut author in the sci-fi genre. This was an absolute breakout work from the jump. There was no way that this book was not going to be successful, just because of the buzz, just because of the word of mouth that had kind of accreted around it in its pre-publication phase. Then, of course, when it was released, it was huge. And the audiobook by Will Wheaton is one of the most downloaded audiobooks on audible.com. The book received the Alex Award from the Young Adult Library Services Association division of the American Library Association, and won the 2012 Prometheus Award, and left, well, I was going to say its mark, but it would be more accurate to say left a crater in geek culture. This was such a definitive work, definitive of 2011, definitive of our memories of the late 1980s too. I mean, it's very difficult to kind of overstate the impact that Ready Player One had and the host of imitators that it spawned, none of which, interestingly, because it's worth noting that when there is an unexpected success in publishing, generally speaking, there is then a response of at least a half dozen novels trying to hit the same note, trying to emulate the same kind of aesthetic, the same tone, the same subject, the same quality, that indefinable quality that makes Ready Player One what it is. And Ready Player One didn't really trigger that backlash because Ernest Cline's geek cred was just so unassailable. I can't imagine any author who is currently working, who is in a position to write a book like Ready Player One that could do the things that Ready Player One does effectively. Let's get into our breakdown of the structure. Basically, what I'm going to do is talk about the book a little bit specifically. We're going to talk about it structurally and narratively, talk a little about the narrative voice, talk a little about Wade as a character and the problems that we may have with him. And then we're going to move through some of the more kind of prominent thematic topics which arise from this text. But if you have any questions, shout out in the YouTube chat. Angela notes in the chat, it is rumored that Cline is working on a sequel. I believe that rumor first aired in like 2012. So Armada was not a huge hit. It's not even fair to say it wasn't a huge hit. Armada didn't have the same effect as Ready Player One. It was never going to. It's entirely probable that Ernest Cline will spend the rest of his career with, failing to have a hit the size of Ready Player One, because most authors don't have a hit the size of Ready Player One. That's just completely, understandable there. Good. Okay, let's get into our breakdown then. So basically the synopsis is this. The year 2044, the world has been crippled by an energy crisis, effectively. The economy here in the United States has cracked apart. There are disenfranchised people by the millions struggling to living in these stacks of old trailers here in Oklahoma City. In fact, Wade's stack, where he spends the first act of the novel, effectively, is about gosh, about 10 blocks from here. We actually get not quite an address, but we get a description of where he is in the city, and he's basically halfway up Portland, which is, yeah, about 10 blocks that way as I'm sitting here recording this. In the movie, the entire action has been moved to Columbus, Ohio, which I actually think, while being, a little disappointed that we're not going to get a movie where the first act is set in Oklahoma City, I get why we've done that. I get why we're moving the action to Columbus, Ohio. That makes a lot of sense. I'm presuming, of course, that we're going to maintain Columbus as the setting for most of the rest of the novel too. That works for me. I'm not sure that we need to separate the action there and we get a stronger sense of place and time. But in any case, that's where we start. So to escape the dystopia outside their homes, most people have sought refuge in the Oasis, sought a kind of recreational refuge in the Oasis, this massively multiplayer online role-playing game that has turned into, Second Life Plus, or Third Life, I suppose, this de facto online interactive environment. This is the digital world. This is where people go. They're connected to it through technology, which in 2011 was even more speculative than it is today. Today, the technology of haptic feedback and the visor technology, even the retinal projection technology that Wade describes after he moves to Columbus, that stuff is happening. It's coming. We're going to have that not in 2044, but probably in 2022. I think we're a lot closer to that than we may expect. So the story follows Wade Watts. He is our protagonist. We pick up basically after the little prologue. We pick up 5 years after the death of James Halliday, the creator of the Oasis, and his announcement that there is a quest, a grand quest to uncover 3 keys, to unlock 3 gates, and to win an unfathomable amount of money, but much more importantly, control over the Oasis. 5 years have passed, no progress has been made, and we pick up with Wade living in the stacks, trying to get through school, trying to, almost trivially trying to crack this enigmatic mystery, this mystery that has apparently, judging from the first third of the book, completely defined modern culture. It's fascinating. It's a fascinating setup. It's a really strong setup and gives us justification for the callback to 1980s pop culture. We may question whether any kind of cultural phenomenon in this distributed, anarchic, fragmented, fractional version of the internet that we have even today, we can question whether anything is going to have the impact of the Oasis. We can question whether any kind of single cultural force or technological force is going to unify everyone. That, to me, is the biggest conceit of Ready Player One. Certainly, there are huge narrative forces in the sense of movies and video games and immersive experiences out there. There are huge cultural forces out there, but they're lacking the reach that old, cultural phenomenon used to have. We just don't have the idea that, what was it? A third of the US population sat and watched the finale of MASH. We just don't have that now. Even the Super Bowl doesn't get that kind of number now. So it's a little difficult to believe that we're going to move into this completely integrated online world. But if you get the pass there, if you can buy into the vision that James Halliday via Ernest Cline kind of presents to us, then it makes a lot of sense. And of course, we should note that right from the beginning, the Oasis is introduced to us not just as an escape, not just as an alternate world, not just as a digital world, but crucially a digital world that is open source, a digital world that, or I guess not entirely open source, but it is at least freely available, which speaks very strongly to that kind of late 80s, early 90s punk rock coder aesthetic and sensibility. These are the people who in the real world, this is Linus Torvalds. This is the creator of Linux. This is, Steve Wozniak. These are the technologists who sought to distribute and open technology to as many people as possible. And the core conflict of Ready Player One is exactly that tension. It is the tension between technology as a distributed, empowering force for good in the world, and technology as a tool of the totalitarian regime, tool of the fascistic and very, very evil IOI corporation, which is right at the heart of the antagonism. Yeah. Let me see. Color Twitter says, shit, I had no idea about MASH. Crap, I know. It was the olden days. Those numbers are huge. There is no television event in the 21st century that has got or will ever get that kind of saturation in the marketplace. It just doesn't happen. We live in a post-distributed world right now where it is very difficult to make your mark, but that doesn't matter because artistically speaking, you don't have to reach everyone in order to be successful. You just have to reach your audience. We've moved to a platform now, whether we're talking about television or movies or the internet, certainly, kind of independent content creation on the internet. We've moved to a point, hey, look, I'm doing it right now. We've moved to a point where engagement is more important than reach because we're not as dependent on advertisers as we used to be. That's just a cultural shift that has occurred over the course of the last 40 years, I guess. So the structure of Ready Player One is actually genuinely fascinating because it is cribbed from the structure of the Easter egg hunt, the quest that is encoded within the Oasis. Halliday encodes 3 keys, 3 gates. That's 3-act structure right there. And that 3-act structure is actually, to a certain degree, mirrored in the structure of the novel itself. It's not perfect. It's not quite there, but it is close. Wade's personal journey does map to the exploration of, to the resolution of his quest within the Oasis. So we get the first act takes us all the way through the stacks up to Wade's departure from Oklahoma City to Columbus in the wake of the first key, the first gate, his meeting with Nolan, whose name I can never remember because I'm so caught up on the fact that he's named for Nolan Bushnell. What is the guy's name? Nolan Sorrento. That's what it is. I deliberately made a note of that because I knew that I would forget his surname. Because when I think of Nolan Sorrento, Ernest Cline has confirmed that Nolan Sorrento is named for Nolan Bushnell, who was the head of Atari back in the 1980s. Nolan Bushnell is a fascinating figure. You guys, if you have time, go Wikipedia him. He is just a titanic figure in the video games and technology industries. So, after that meeting and the bomb that goes off in Wade's stack, he leaves Oklahoma City behind and goes to Columbus, Ohio. That is basically our first act. So the first act basically roughly maps to the first gate, but what we do functionally for Wade is remove his real life support system, such as it is. He doesn't really have one. He doesn't really have a real life support system, but what little he has is taken from him and he is forced into action. It's actually a really strong turning point, right? Right there at the end of the first act, the transition into the second act as we move to Columbus and he starts his quasi-autonomous, quasi-adult life, I suppose. That is really nicely done. That is very, very strong structure. Act 2 takes us through to basically the planning of the Castle Anorak attack. It's basically through to the decamping of our primary protagonists to Oregon. That seems to be our transition into the third act. There, arguably, I would say it's actually the meeting in the closed chat room. It's the meeting where Og reveals himself. That is actually the transition into the third act. That's where our conflict is locked. We understand what we have to do, but we're not quite ready to do it just yet. The midpoint, by the way, in Act 2, the midpoint in any story is a point which falls roughly in the middle of the second act and is a major point of inflection. It can change the direction of the plot. It can change our understanding of the plot. It can be epiphanic in that it involves some major realization, or it can change the protagonist's circumstances. The midpoint in Ready Player One is, in some senses, one of my favorite midpoints that I've read in contemporary fiction, and in some senses kind of frustrating because we're not given all the information. We're not quite... The novel does not quite play fair with the reader. I'm talking about that beat where Wade all but surrenders to IOI and enters indentured servitude. He arranges his own arrest, as it were. I say that it doesn't entirely play fair with the audience because we're not told in advance about his admin passwords for IOI. We are not told what his plan is, which is problematic in a novel which presents itself in this very intimate perspective. We're very close to Wade throughout the entire arc of the novel. So when he withholds from us, it does feel as though it's not being entirely transparent. And I'm not sure that it wouldn't work better if we had at least some sense of what Wade was planning. If he can tell us, well, I have these passwords, I'm going into IOI, this is going to be difficult, this is going to be incredibly dangerous, if I screw up, this is the rest of my life and I'm done. I'm not sure that wouldn't be at least as effective as the turn that we get here. But either way, it works quite nicely as a as a turning point there. So we move into the third act, which is basically initially the preparation for the attack on Castle Anorak, and then the attack itself, moving into the final climax. The dark moment would be the trigger of the apocalyptic cataclysm, which is one of the best proper nouns that Cline invents in the frame of this novel. I love cataclysm with basically my whole heart. That's a very, very good word for what it is. And then, of course, we get the dodge there with Wade's extra life from the Pac-Man machine in the perfect game that he played. And then we enter the climax itself with Tempest and Adventure and King Arthur and Monty Python and so on and so forth. That is our climax right there, the challenge of the final gate, as it were. So the structure is straightforward. It's a very simple, very kind of elemental structure, which almost becomes kind of ungainly because it echoes the structure of the Easter egg quest itself. The 3 keys, 3 gate structure replicated in the frame of the novel itself is a little, I suppose the best word that I can use is blunt. It is inelegant, but not ineffective. It is not finely crafted, but it is well crafted. And I think that that's an important distinction. And let me be very clear here. For a novel of this quality, for a novel possessed of this kind of ambition, and for, lest we forget, a debut novel, this is a very solid, very archetypal structure. And I think that Cline does an excellent job with it. On reflection, it is a little bit brutalistic. It is a little bit, heavy there, right at the heart of the novel. I'm not sure that there's a better way of doing that while still honoring the 3 keys, 3 gates structure that Halliday encoded into the Oasis. So there's only so much that you can do. If you accept that as a premise, naturally, those 3 gates are going to pretty much mirror your act breaks. But that's fine. It's fine. As I say, some moments in the plot betray, the need of some narrative duct tape, the absence of the IOI passwords as Wade goes into his period of indentured servitude. I think that is a little problematic there. But there are some moments of really great foreshadowing. The Cataclysm, I think, is foreshadowed beautifully. Even the perfect Pac-Man game and the magical quarter that Wade gets, I think that's foreshadowed beautifully. And there are moments of really genuine kind of heart and emotional interaction within the span of the novel that work very well for me, which is not to say that everything works very well for me. We'll talk about some of that later. Mitch says, I felt like the way it told its story echoed the period it was referencing, but that's just my perception of 80s storytelling. That's actually fair. I think that in the 80s, we did have, particularly, not in the 1980s in aggregate, I think, but with specific regard to the kinds of movies that are referenced in Ready Player One, to the kinds of stories that we're discussing, when we're name-checking Goonies and The Last Starfighter and War Games and those 80s movies, then we absolutely see that kind of resurgence of an archetypal 3-act structure. Those are very strongly structured movies. If you haven't seen The Last Starfighter, which, by the way, only gets, a fleeting reference in the novel. I would have liked there to be a little more from The Last Starfighter there, but we get the greetings, Starfighter. You have been recruited by the Star League to defend the frontier against Zur and the Kodan Armada. I didn't write that down, you guys. I just remember that from heart because I spent a lot of my childhood watching The Last Starfighter. Those kinds of movies absolutely rely on that 3-act structure. And if you're looking for a good example of that, do look at The Last Starfighter. Do look at The Last Starfighter. That's an excellent structural element. Good. Mitch also says, Ready Player One ending with the beat the bad guys, get the girl, win the prize felt fitting for me as I associate the 80s with that form of storytelling. Yes, no, I think that's absolutely fair. Yeah, I think you're completely right. I think that yes, he is this is the trick with Cline's nostalgia, right? Is that he's not just referencing a lot of the criticism around Ready Player One, basically resorts to accusations of proper noun spam, that paragraphs will degenerate into lists of 1980s arcade games or lists of 1980s movies or lists of 1980s albums. But that I don't think is fair. I genuinely don't think that is fair criticism of this novel because A, that is purposeful, that is intentional. He is trying to engender that sense of when you are a kid and you go to Blockbuster or you go to Toys R Us or you go to your local video game store. I don't know what it was here in the US, EB Games, I guess, Electronic Boutique, something like that. And you stand in the aisle and you are besieged by options, and you know what none of these things are, but they are all open to you. That is what Ernest Cline is trying to evoke here, I genuinely believe. I think he's trying to echo that experience that so many of us have had. So I don't necessarily buy the idea that this is in any way less well-intentioned or less narratively effective. And he is absolutely echoing that 1980s structure. He's not just evoking the proper nouns. He's not just wielding the proper nouns here. He betrays a complete understanding of the narrative tropes and conventions of that structure. There is an interesting paper to be written mapping Ready Player One to War Games, which is, of course, arguably the most important single text in the frame of the novel, in the narrative frame of the novel. I think you could really look at Ready Player One, then look at War Games and draw some really interesting contrasts and conclusions about the association there. Now, I'm talking a lot about the narrative voice and the presence at the heart of this novel of Wade. And Wade is problematic, you guys. He is problematic. He is not always a great guy. He is, as has been noted in the YouTube chat, pedantic. He is, as has been noted in the YouTube chat, narcissistic. He is undermotivated. He is selfish. There is a particularly unpleasant beat right after his stack has been destroyed, in which he's talking to H, over, I think it's a phone call at that point. I forget. But in any case, he's talking to H right after that. And H mentions Artemis. And Wade notes that his mood brightens when he thinks of Artemis. And it's like, dude, it has been 5 minutes. And I know that you don't really care for your aunt. That's fine. But a lot of people just died. And you are obsessing about this geek girl. And I would argue, and will argue in just a few minutes' time, that Artemis is perhaps the most problematic element in the entire book. I am not crazy about Artemis from Wade's perspective. I'm kind of crazy about Artemis as a character, and I'm really hoping that the movie is going to go some way toward really establishing her capability and, much more importantly, her independence and agency. But I'm not crazy about her in the structure of the novel for reasons that I'll get to in just a bit. So I do think it's fair, too, to be left a little cold by Wade. And this is going to lead us into basically my biggest question about Ready Player One, or my biggest set of questions, all of which fall under the heading of intentionality. How much does Cline mean what he says in this book? How much of this novel is played completely straight, and how much of this novel is subtly satirical? To what extent is Cline giving us a flat and kind of almost superficial perspective on this world, and to what degree is he aware of the internal inconsistencies and is highlighting them? And I'm asking this as an open question because the novel itself is genuinely ambiguous. In this novel, at the highest level, at the core conflict of the novel, we are opposing the kind of utopian idyll of the Oasis and IOI, this evil, outright, murderous, fascistic organization that is going to oppress everyone and put ads on everything and charge a sign-up fee and basically, effectively, take the Oasis away from the people who need it most. But the Oasis was formed by a company that can afford to pay out billions of dollars as a prize. I mean, the idea that corporations are bad is fundamentally antithetical to our understanding of how we arrived at this place in the first place. The idea that the man is inherently evil, that kind of encoded power structure is inherently evil, is problematic when we spend half of the book worshiping at the altar of James Halliday. And I genuinely don't know. Is Ernest Cline using this opposition, this discontinuity of interpretation and experience as a means of eliciting a kind of satirical effect? Does he want us to look at this and say, this is oh so terribly adolescent? The man is, evil because he represents what you are not, because he represents codified and encoded power structures, because he represents codified and encoded wealth and a kind of authority and a kind of agency that you yourself do not have. Is this a novel of adolescent rebellion? Well, I mean, yeah, it absolutely is, in fact. And we see that throughout the book, whether it's Wade and H and Artemis, or it's characters like Og, who kind of fills that Steve Wozniak role, that utopian idealist role that we see echoed in real life. You know, it's fair to say from a certain perspective that Og and Halliday together kind of represent the Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak dichotomy. It's not clean. You know, each of them has characteristics associated with both of those real life figures, but there is a similar kind of opposition there. Should technology be free? Should technology be, you know, accessible? Should technology be the preserve of the wealthy? Should we control or should we liberate? What is our perspective on these tools effectively? For example, when I talk about intentionality, one of the things that bothers me the most in this book is the handling of H's gender and ethnicity and sexuality. When H's real world identity is revealed to him at the end of the novel, Wade consciously and explicitly continues to refer to her, at least within the bounds of the Oasis and H's digital personality, as him. Now, this is problematic. Or not. This is complicated, right? There is an ambiguity here. Is Wade honoring the integrity of H's digital persona? Is he seeing H's digital persona? H's digital persona, of course, being this Caucasian male heterosexual archetype, you know? Is Wade honoring H's digital persona as a real extension of her identity and thus respecting her when he refers to H's digital avatar as him? Or is Wade dismissing H's true identity and using pronouns which are simply more comfortable for him, particularly in the context of their long-established relationship? Either, both, arguably, the novel is ambiguous. Does it really understand what it is saying, or are we able to interpret through the gaps in Cline's intent a greater satirical intent? I genuinely don't know. At the end of the day, I genuinely don't know whether this is a satirical masterpiece or actually a kind of half-formed and in some ways juvenile, in some ways adolescent, in some ways problematic perspective on geek culture in 2011 and geek culture in 1986. I'm not sure about it. And when I say I'm not sure about it, this is not about Cline's real intent. I don't need an interview with Ernest Cline to tell me the truth of it, because I'm talking about the text itself. The text itself is ambiguous. And given that it is ambiguous, I am inclined to take the most generous read. I am inclined to look at this and say, no, this is actually a pretty sophisticated deconstruction of some of these ideas. And one of the reasons that Wade is not as likable as we might want him to be is that he's not supposed to be. We're supposed to see the cracks in his personality, the inadequacies in his personality, and we're supposed to allow for that possibility of growth. That's a tough sell when you are this close to a protagonist for the entirety of the novel. We never deviate from Wade's POV, which is difficult sometimes. Let me dip into the YouTube chat and see your responses here. Yeah, Gildarts Winter says that Halliday wanted to create something for people. IOI just wants to use people, is what I understood out of the lines of morality here. Yes. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Okay, we mustn't kind of conflate the purposes of these two organizations, but they are both giant organizations. And if they're both giant organizations, then being a giant organization in and of itself cannot be bad. And oftentimes in the course of particularly the first act, and again, it's ambiguous, I'm perfectly prepared to accept that this is a part of Wade's, you know, adolescent lack of perspective, and he grows into a greater perspective, certainly as IOI reveals its true nature, he certainly does. Is it possible that Wade is just adolescent and ignorant about such things, or is Cline making a deeper point? Said this is a very great read. How much of Artemis is Wade's dream girl, like Ramona in Scott Pilgrim? The connection between Artemis and Ramona Flowers in Scott Pilgrim, Andrew, is striking. You are absolutely right. Artemis exists primarily to be Wade's dream girl. And I'm going to talk a little about some of the ways in which that is problematic as we move in. Angela also notes that she likes Wade more because Will Wheaton was reading him. I do think that Wade comes off better in the audiobook, but then again, I think that's because Wheaton is bringing a certain sophistication to his read. There are inflections and inferences in the performance of the audiobook which are not evident on the page. Now, it may be that Ernest Cline gave Wheaton notes that he said, hey, Will, this is how I want this line to be interpreted, and Will Wheaton gave that performance. That may be it. Or he may be interpreting the text himself. It's difficult to pin down exactly what is what. And the broader point of this, of course, if there is this amount of ambiguity in the heart of the text, in the core of the text, then the text is, to some extent, failing in its fundamental purpose, which is to communicate the story itself. Ambiguity is not a bad thing within a text, but when there is so much ambiguity that you can interpret this as a celebration of regressive, old-fashioned, oppressive, prejudiced, digital culture, or interpret it as a satire of those cultures and actually a progressive argument in favor of opening up digital discourse, has really succeeded. It's tricky, certainly. Let me see. Aaron argues too. Yes, this is another great point, and exactly on this topic. Aaron argues Halliday wanted to force the world to adapt to his tastes and understand him, rather than adapt to understand the world. Troublesome, but that is one way to achieve greatness. I mean, it kind of is, but I'm reminded of Steve Jobs, right? I'm reminded of the absolute control that Steve Jobs had over the Mac line while he was running Apple, particularly in the years immediately prior to his death. The arguments that would be the compelling arguments for better and more capable Macs, for better and more capable iPhones that would cost a little more or would be thicker. I mean, this has always been my argument against Apple. I want a phone that's a little bit thicker, but has a battery that can get me through an entire day, like an entire 24-hour period. That's what I want. But Steve Jobs did not want to sacrifice the aesthetics, the design integrity of his products in order to accommodate the world. You will get what he gives you, and it would be a very constrained line. Apple, of course, isn't quite that anymore and is suffering for that. So perhaps there is a reason that I'm not running a multinational, multi-billion-dollar tech company, turns out. Let me see here. Skipa, I think, had an excellent point. Yes. Yes, there wasn't a discussion within the book. We're talking here about H. Gildarts Winter says it is respect for what H wanted to be called, talking about Wade referring to H within the digital realm of the Oasis by the pronoun him, him and his and so on. But Skipper replies, there wasn't a discussion within the book where Wade asked what H would have wanted, so what we get is a white man making a choice for a black woman. Yes, we do. Yes, we do. And the broader problem there is that, God, H feels so much when she is revealed as though we are just ticking minority boxes, right? It feels as though we are just, no, actually we have a black character here, and we have another female character who isn't a manic pixie dream girl, and we have a gay character. Hey, look at us. We've done everything that we need to do. But the authenticity of H's experience in the digital world, whether it's in 1986 or 2011 or 2024, is fundamentally different from Wade's experience of the digital world. And we get some acknowledgement of this in the book when we're told the story about H's mother, and H's mother masquerading as, disguising herself as a white heterosexual man in order to make her life easier, and who are we, any of us, to judge that decision? But part of the consequence of that, particularly as Wade tries to kind of reintegrate his understanding of H, the real person, and his understanding of H, the digital avatar, part of the consequence of that is that we seek to normalize being white and male and heterosexual within the digital space. And that kind of erasure is a real and pressing, urgent problem today, right now on the internet, you guys. It is a real problem for women, for people of color, for the entire LGBTQ community to not just be visible online and in online spaces, but to establish online spaces all their own. So while we get a perspective on H and her experience, we don't get a counterpoint perspective, effectively. We don't get, God, for most of the novel, Artemis may as well be the only girl on the internet. I mean, that really is where we are. We deal with so many few named characters, so few named named female characters in the course of this book, that Artemis stands apart as she is supposed to, because she is the manic pixie dream girl, cyber goddess, geek girl fantasy that we want her to be. But H doesn't give us another perspective on that. And Artemis, God knows, doesn't give us a perspective on that in any way. It's not to say necessarily that it's bad. It's to say that it's potentially bad. It's to say that we are normalizing problematic perceptions of what is normal, right? We're normalizing normal. Normal means white and male and heterosexual. And anything that's not that needs to conform to normality in order to kind of earn its place, or needs to exist as a counterpoint to normality in order to kind of earn its place or to justify its place. And that's really problematic. And again, not problematic in a narrative sense, super problematic in a real world political sense. You know, these are fights that are happening today. People are suffering today because of this kind of erasure. You know, I have been involved in video games my entire life. I should probably say, in fact, that I myself am a few years younger than Ernest Cline. I'm, 5 years younger than Ernest Cline, but I grew up with exactly the same experience. I grew up with Atari 2600s and Tempest and Pac-Man and Adventure and Zork and all of the things. And War Games is literally one of my favorite movies of all time. So I was able to, along with Wade, recite the opening scene there as he's moving through the first gate. I am there for this. But over the course of the last 15, 20 years, we've seen more and more conversations, more and more perspectives on the presence of and role of and oppression of women and people of color and people of differing gender identities and sexual identities in gaming specifically and in the internet. This has been really tough over the last few years, and Ernest Cline has given a handbook to those who want to, you know, tip their fedoras and say, thank you, milady. There are parts of this that are kind of gross. And not all of that is Ernest Cline's fault. You know, it's not his fault that some people have taken his book and kind of adapted that as a handbook. But that doesn't mean that there aren't problematic elements contained within the novel. And we should talk, while we're talking about this too, about Artemis. Artemis is the perfect geek girl, and she is the perfect geek girl specifically because she is a part of the masculine power dynamic within the Oasis. The entire construct of the Oasis is masculine. The introduction that we get to social interactions between Wade and H and IROC and, you know, some of the other characters early in the novel establish this elitist clubhouse mentality, particularly in the Oasis in general, but particularly within the Gunter community. Artemis gets to exist there because she's just one of the boys, and she can play those games too, but also she's super hot, you guys. She's super hot. And there is, as I said, some unpleasant kind of fedora tipping from Wade, in which he assures us that he's super interested in her personality, and it doesn't matter what her body is. But the biggest problem here is Wade's privilege when it comes to enacting, creating, spontaneously generating his relationship with Artemis. He assumes that because he likes her and he's a good guy, that he has a right to a relationship with her. And I'm putting good guy in quotes there, and right, obviously, in quotes too. This is dehumanizing. This is actively dehumanizing. We are stripping Artemis of her agency, and we are making her an adjunct to him. She is nothing but a satellite that is orbiting him throughout most of this novel. And that is really problematic because, again, it's difficult within the frame of the novel, but it's super difficult within the frame of actual online discourse, actual, you know, internet culture. This is a huge problem. This is the, you know, hashtag not all men phenomenon. And it's gross. It makes me really uncomfortable, particularly in the scene after he claims the first key and she shows up and they have basically their first meeting. We've already been introduced to her remotely, of course, but they have their first meeting and he is awkward and awful and she is inexplicably charmed by him. And because we never deviate from Wade's POV, because we never get a sense of Artemis's interiority, because she is just inscrutable, hey, you know how girls are, and then disappears from the narrative for a long time so that he can suffer nobly and earn his relationship with her at the end of the novel, because we never get a perspective on Artemis. We have no idea what she sees in him. We have no idea why she is attracted to this guy. Because I got to tell you, I am not attracted to this guy. I do not understand what it is that she sees in him. It's, yeah, as Becca Eller says, it's kind of gross. I don't love this relationship at all. Yeah. It's, yes, it is problematic, but at the same time, I don't necessarily think that that means that Artemis is, okay, I want to be very careful to distinguish this. I don't necessarily think that Artemis is a bad character. I think that Artemis, through our exclusive, Wade-oriented view of her, is problematic. Yes. Good. Okay. Let me see as I catch up here. Entitlement to a relationship, says Brian. That seems like an incoherent attitude for a nerdy, pudgy IRL guy who doesn't have any exceptionalism in the Oasis either until he finds the first key. Yeah. But of course, he does have exceptionalism. And his exceptionalism is perhaps the most interesting thing about Ready Player One. We are introduced to this dystopian world of 2044, where because of the energy crisis, because of climate change, because of the collapse of the US economy, and certainly, as is suggested through the pages of the novel, the global economy, people are suffering. The world is in decline. The world is in its last days, it seems. It doesn't really seem as though there's any path to the future. There's no kind of sense of progression. There's no optimism. There's no hope. There's no improvement here. Nothing can be done. So we retreat from the real world into the Oasis. And it's interesting that even when Artemis and Wade are talking about what they would do with the money, Wade says, well, I would build a starship and I would invite some of my friends and scientists and doctors and we would leave. We are done. The world as we knew it is finished. It is game over down there. But one of the interesting things about Ready Player One is that that is happening while we have this global cultural regression. Because of Halliday and because of the Easter egg embedded in the Oasis, the entire world has turned backward. We are now looking back to the cultural artifacts of the 1980s, and there is no sense, with the exception of some modern games technology, I guess, and even then we're kind of still echoing the tropes of the past. There's no sense that the world is moving forward. No one is producing new art, as far as we know, within the pages of Ready Player One, within this kind of slice of society, which, judging from Wade's perspective at least, is all society. No one is producing new art. No one is producing new TV shows. The only new TV show that we get is the terrible IOI interactive training film that he watches while he's indentured there, or I guess doesn't watch while he's indentured there, avoids watching while he's indentured there. That's the face of modern art and creativity. So there is an argument that what Halliday has done is slam the brakes on social progress. He has simultaneously given everyone an escape hatch, given everyone an opportunity to forget about their problems in the real world and just go level with your magic sword and your blaster and your X-Wing fighter and just go and explore, the arcades of his youth and this sunset twilight idyll of Midtown Ohio. And simultaneously, he has removed any urgency for the creation of new art. He has removed any desire to progress, to improve. There is a really strong argument, I think, a sociological kind of cultural, even an economic argument, that James Halliday is the greatest monster in history. Because other monsters have arisen and they have threatened individuals and they have threatened communities and they have threatened cultures. Halliday ended progress on the planet Earth. And he did it in 5 years. Didn't do it alone, admittedly. There is climate change. There is the energy crisis. There is the economic crisis. All of those things are already happening. That's true. But through his game, he has all but destroyed the motive force behind art. No one is creating anything new. We are simply recovering and recycling the artifacts of the past. The passage toward the end of the second act, when Wade is telling the reader about everyone's personalized video streams, right? That you can schedule anything you like on your video stream and people will watch it and you can run ads against it and that's a source of income. And he's doing it and Artemis is doing it and H is doing it and that's great. Everyone is kind of making their money from their own personalized YouTube channels, I guess. Their own, constantly rolling broadcast YouTube channels. I suppose more like a Twitch channel than a YouTube channel. But none of that is new. There are blog posts, I suppose, and personal videos that people make, but really all they're doing is excavating the past and unfolding it back into modern culture. And every time you do that, it itself and your response to it is diminished. The art itself becomes less valuable through not just repetition, but wholesale industrialized repetition. And that leaves us with arguably the most successful thing that Ready Player One manages to accomplish in its run, which is the way in which Gunter interactions are observed and framed. What we're talking about really is trivia as social currency, knowledge in the broadest sense, but a trivial, decontextualized, fact-based kind of knowledge. Wade is not possessed of wisdom. Wisdom comes from learning and integrating your knowledge with your experience. Wisdom comes from having a contextual framework around the facts that you know. You can be educated, you can be taught facts, but you become wise when you understand the connections between those facts, the way that they interrelate, the way that they exert gravitational influence, the way that they reflect and echo other facts that you know, the way that you begin to intuit and understand the patterns between those facts. Gunter culture in particular, but apparently all Oasis culture, is very fact-oriented and not at all wisdom-oriented. We know the trivia. We can quote verbatim Monty Python and the Holy Grail. We can quote verbatim War Games. We can quote verbatim Family Ties. We can quote verbatim the details of this obscure 1960s Japanese anime series. We can do all of these things, but none of it means anything. None of it actually has cultural weight. So real conversation has been replaced. And we see this most powerfully in the first exchange between Wade and IROC, kind of Wade and H initially, and then Wade and IROC, where Wade exerts his intellectual dominance over IROC by knowing more inane trivia. Now, I love trivia. I love the facts associated with my favorite cultural properties and pieces of art. I can tell you all about, the way the transporters work on the USS Enterprise, and I can tell you all the way about, I can tell you how lightsabers are forged and all of that. I'm a nerd for that stuff too. But what is lacking in Gunter interactions is actual emotional significance, at least within the first act and a half of the book, at least up until that midpoint in the book. So conversation and kind of social interaction, social relationships are replaced by this challenge response transactive kind of passphrase communication. I say the thing and then you say the thing that you're supposed to say, and hey, we are bonded. We are not having a conversation. We are not connecting as individuals, you and I, but what we are doing, crucially, is exerting our own social identity. We are proving to each other and to everyone who is listening that we are part of the same tribe, that we are part of the same community. I know the beginning of this line, you know the end of this line, thus we are, connected. We have this social currency that we can share. And that is, it's beautifully observed. And it's true not just of Gunter culture in the context of the novel, and not just true of geek culture in the real world. Literally every kind of micro community forges these rules, will fall back on this kind of transactive social interaction in order to establish identity. This is true of doctors or lawyers or teachers or construction workers or whoever. Every community has these rules. If you are a fan of the same sports team as someone else, you will say the first half of the chant and they will say the second half of the chant. And hey, we're the same. You will sing the first line of the lyric from your favorite song and someone else will respond with, oh, hey, I know that song. And hey, we're the same. This is how we signify tribal identity. And that is enormously powerful in the context of Ready Player One, because Wade's identity, his entire identity, is connected to the Gunters and is connected to Halliday. And we see that play out really quite beautifully at the end of the book. I have to say, I'm out of time already, which is kind of astonishing. There is a lot left to say here. Angela says that she wants to live on the Firefly planet. Yes. The Evocation of Serenity, which we're told heartbreakingly was originally named Kaylee before Wade had the temerity to rename it the Vonnegut. I love Kurt Vonnegut, but let's be honest, it should be called the Kaylee. That's fine. I was very impressed with that, and I loved that ship the most until we got to the introduction of the Cowboy Bebop, basically right at the end. Yes, that's a great ship. That's a very, very good ship. Shoto showing up in the Bebop to Wade's Sanctuary was really strong. Let me wrap up by saying this. What is Ready Player One? Ready Player One is a slice of geek culture. As I've said, 3 slices of geek culture in a sense. It is speculatively a perspective on 2044, a perspective on a dystopian world that is not quite realistic, but is realistic adjacent. It is quasi-naturalistic. It's not ever actually literally going to happen, but something like it could. As I say, you know, I'm most skeptical about the utter ubiquity of the Oasis. But that aside, yes, this 2044 is recognizable to those of us here in 2017. It is also a slice of 2011 geek culture, the ongoing conversations about freedom of information, the ongoing conversations about Creative Commons and open source software, the ongoing conversations about who controls the internet. You know, I was going to say that the net neutrality argument was super important in 2011. Hey, you guys, the net neutrality argument is super important in 2017 too. Who controls the pipe? Who controls the infrastructure of the internet upon which we all rely? Do we want to give up our freedom for safety and security? Do we want to embrace the totalitarian regime that will govern us on the internet and keep us oh so very safe and stop us from getting spam and pop-up ads and viruses, but will also restrict our freedoms? These are ongoing conversations, and there were ongoing conversations back in 1986, 1988, 1990, 1992. You know, these are conversations that we've been having for as long as there has been an internet, certainly for as long as there has been consumer technology, certainly. Ultimately, Ready Player One is, for me, a more complex book than it appears. And I have to believe that it is a more complex book than it appears, because superficially, there are problematic elements within this book. Superficially, this book is also a riotous adventure story and a really great high-octane speculative fiction take on the technology and the pop culture properties that I loved growing up. So I can enjoy it. I can disengage my brain and simply enjoy it for what it is. But I suppose, let me put it this way, this is perhaps the more positive interpretation. But for me, Cline has done something much more impressive than that. He has done something much more impressive than name check a bunch of Atari cartridges and arcade games. What he's done very subtly is open up that particular slice, that particular stratum of geek culture to our inspection. He has, by planting it in this speculative world, in this kind of post-naturalistic world, allowed us to see it for what it is. He has allowed us to see the rampant toxicity and cynicism and hopelessness of these shallow, transactive, fact-oriented interactions. It is no mistake, it is no accident that what redeems Wade in the end is personal interaction. And this, I think, is one of the things that makes me think that Cline did in fact intend all of this, did in fact intend this to be a much more complex novel than it may appear to be in its first half. By the time that Wade is cut off from the world in Columbus and is actively lamenting the fact that he doesn't have personal connections with people, that he is alone, by the time that we're talking about his place in the world, the farcical account of his experience with the very expensive sex toy and the fact that it is just elaborate masturbation, and thus highlights and isolates his own loneliness. You know, it exaggerates his own loneliness. That, I think, is very, very powerful. When we talk about Daito being hikikomori, when we talk about Daito being a shut-in, and about how that is an actual phenomenon, you know, and has been an actual phenomenon for the latter half of the 20th century in Japan, that the disconnection from those people around us render our every interaction facile and superficial and no more important to us as human beings, as creative individuals, as people who are complex and contradictory, than getting the ding at the end of a quest and getting your 40 experience points and your pouch of gold pieces and your new magic sword. We can't gamify social interaction. We mustn't gamify social interaction. And, well, okay, actually, both of those. We mustn't gamify social interaction, but also fundamentally, we can't gamify social interaction. Because even Wade, who seeks to gamify social interaction as much as humanly possible, fails. Because ultimately, it is about real people. Ultimately, it is about social connection. And I choose to take that as the message of Ready Player One. I choose to see Ready Player One as an optimistic warning of what may come, rather than, you know, a sign that geek culture in particular is irrevocably sliding toward the abyss. That, you guys, is going to do it. Oh, Eric recommends, I want to recommend Rainbow's End by Werner Vinge, is a novel that deals with very similar themes from a very different perspective. Actually, if we're recommending things, I will recommend the novel Pandora's Star by Peter F. Hamilton, which is also kind of predicated on okay, I won't go too deeply into it, but if you're interested in this kind of Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak relationship and the argument over what technology should be and the uses to which technology should be put, there's a really interesting subplot in Pandora's Star by Peter F. Hamilton. So I recommend that and its sequel, Judas Unchained. They're really pretty solid books, actually. That, I think, is going to do it, though, for this one-shot. If you would like to have your own subject here, if you would like to pick the subject for the next one-shot, head on over to patreon.com/PointNorthMedia and pledge your support, and we can make that happen. Guys, it has been an absolute pleasure. I should say, be following this up with a Point North one-shot on the movie Ready Player One when that is released. I'm actually really looking forward to that. I know that the trailer has attracted some flack online, but I think it looks like it is making very smart adaptive choices, and I'm very much into that. So hopefully the movie will give us an even greater perspective on Cline's original intent and these underlying structures that lie just beneath the glossy, chromed cyberpunk superficiality, the superficies of geek culture in 1986 and 2011. It has been an absolute pleasure. I will talk to you all again soon. Until then, take care and go practice your joust.